David Mallister, a Marine veteran who lost his leg in Afghanistan, collapses from unbearable phantom pain. His wife, Emily, rushes him to Lincoln County Medical Center, parking in an emergency zone. A confrontation erupts when Officer Jean Kraton, a jaded security guard, demands they move the car, dismissing David's disability and service. As tensions escalate, Emily stands firm, defending her husband. In a shocking moment, Kraton tasers her, leaving her convulsing on the pavement. David, despite his pain, rises to confront the guard with calm, steely resolve, uttering 6 words that spark a reckoning, leaving readers eager for justice. Please support our channel by liking and subscribing. Share David and Emily's powerful story to honor veterans and caregivers. Your support helps us amplify stories of courage and dignity. Comment your thoughts, share your experiences, and join us in advocating for respect and change. Thank you. The guard's finger trembled on the trigger, his eyes narrowing as he barked, "Back off now!" Emily's hands rose slowly, her palms open in surrender, but her voice quivered with desperation. "Please, we're only here for help," she pleaded, her words fragile against the cold night air. But compassion was absent in the guard's stance. The taser sparked with a sharp electric crackle, and in that fleeting moment, the world froze. David, a Marine veteran who had already sacrificed so much, collapsed onto the ER pavement, his prosthetic leg useless beneath him. Beside him, Emily convulsed, her body racked by the shock, her gasps swallowed by the chaos. David couldn't reach her, couldn't shield her, couldn't even stand. Yet, from the depths of his resolve, his voice emerged, steady as tempered steel, cutting through the night with 6 words that would shift the course of everything. "I'm sorry, sir, but you just made a mistake." Those words hung in the air, a quiet thunder that silenced the hospital's frantic hum. They would spark a full investigation, unraveling the guard's actions and reigniting a nation's conversation about what true strength truly means. David Mallister had never been one to dwell on his burdens. Growing up in the quiet, weathered fields of rural Ohio, he learned early that pain was not something to be voiced, but something to be borne with silent dignity. When his father abandoned them without a word, David was just 12, a boy thrust into manhood overnight. His younger siblings, Rachel and Danny, only 6 and 4, looked to him with wide, trusting eyes, unaware of the weight their brother now carried. He became their protector, their provider, their anchor. Mornings were spent cooking simple meals, burnt toast and scrambled eggs, while evenings were filled with packing lunches and soothing nightmares. After school, he took on odd jobs, mowing lawns, delivering newspapers, anything to ease the strain on his mother, a waitress whose fierce spirit battled the ache of arthritis in her knees. She poured every ounce of herself into keeping their family afloat, but it was David's quiet resolve that held their fragile world together. He didn't dream of glory or escape. He dreamed of giving Rachel and Danny a chance at a life less heavy than his own. The Marines weren't just a job for David. They were a calling, a way to carve out a future for his siblings and Nongs. At 19, he enlisted, his heart steady with purpose. By 24, he was a squad leader in Afghanistan, his calm under fire and instinctive leadership earning the respect of his unit. His men trusted him, not because he was loud or brash, but because he was the one who checked their gear, who memorized their blood types, who stayed awake on watch when exhaustion clawed at them all. But 3 weeks before his 3rd tour was set to end, a roadside IED shattered his world. The explosion was a deafening roar, a blur of dust and blood that stole his left leg below the knee and left him buried in the wreckage of his own body. When he awoke 2 days later in a field hospital, the leg was gone, and with it, the man he had been. What followed was 14 months of surgeries, grueling rehab, and a pain no one could prepare him for. Phantom pain, they called it, a cruel ghost that burned and twisted in the absence of flesh. It haunted him in the dead of night, a relentless reminder of what he'd lost. Yet, through the haze of agony and the weight of a future he couldn't yet see, one person refused to let him slip away. Emily Vargas, now Emily Mallister, was a kindergarten teacher whose laughter could thaw the coldest room. They met at a 4th of July barbecue just 2 weeks before David's final deployment. She wasn't swayed by his uniform or his rank. What caught her heart was the way he knelt beside a little boy who'd scraped his knee, speaking softly, waiting patiently until the child's tears stopped. That quiet strength, that unspoken compassion, drew her to him like a beacon. While he was overseas, they exchanged letters, not emails or calls, but handwritten notes, each word a tether across the miles. When David returned, broken in body and spirit, Emily didn't hesitate. She ran to him in the airport, tears streaming as she embraced not just the man he was, but the man he could still become. 3 days later, in the chaos of baggage claim, he proposed on his one remaining knee, his voice steady despite the tremble in his hands. They married the following spring, and Emily became more than his wife. She became his lifeline. Emily was his nurse, tending to his wounds with a gentleness that belied her own exhaustion. She was his driver, navigating the endless trips to the VA center. She was his advocate, researching prosthetics, sitting through hours of medical consults, and mastering his medications with a precision that rivaled any professional. When depression sank its claws into David, when the pain and the silence in his mind grew too dark, Emily stayed. She sat with him on the bathroom floor during his lowest moments, her presence a quiet promise that he wasn't alone. She read his journals when he couldn't find the words to speak, piecing together the fragments of his heart. And somehow, amidst it all, she continued teaching kindergarten, her smile a gift to children who never knew the weight she carried. Each night she returned home to bathe and bandage the stump of David's leg, her hands steady even as her heart ached for the man she loved. 10 years into their marriage, they had faced countless trials, yet they chose each other every day. David had lost a leg, but in Emily he found something far greater, a reason to keep standing, to keep fighting. That night at the ER, as they lay on the pavement, David's words weren't just a rebuke to the guard. They were a testament to the strength he and Emily had forged together. His voice, calm and unyielding despite the tremble around him, carried the weight of a life shaped by sacrifice and love, a strength that would ripple far beyond that moment, echoing far beyond that hospital, reminding everyone what it truly means to endure. The pain was no stranger to David Mallister, a relentless phantom that had haunted him for years, ever since the accident that claimed his leg. It was a cruel companion, one he'd learned to endure with gritted teeth and sleepless nights, its presence as familiar as the rhythm of his own heartbeat. But this time it was different, merciless, a storm that refused to relent. By the third night, sleep had become a distant memory, with only fleeting moments of rest totaling no more than 2 hours. The ache had morphed from a persistent throb into a raging inferno, blazing through the empty space where his leg once was, searing every nerve in its path. His wife, Emily, had watched him deteriorate with growing alarm, her eyes brimming with worry as she pleaded with him that morning to seek help at the hospital. But David, stubborn as ever, dismissed her concern with a wave of his hand, the same gesture he'd used countless times to push away her fears. "It'll pass," he growled under his breath, his jaw clenched as he stood at the kitchen counter, attempting to prepare breakfast. His hands shook as he spread butter on a slice of toast, each movement a battle against the pain that gnawed at him. But the effort was too much. Halfway through, his strength gave out, and his crutches slipped from under him, clattering to the floor as he collapsed in a heap. Plates shattered around him, the sharp crash echoing the chaos within his body. That was the breaking point. Emily didn't hesitate this time, her resolve overriding his protests. With trembling hands, she knelt beside him, her movements practiced yet unsteady with fear. She helped him up, her touch gentle but firm, supporting his weight as he struggled to regain his footing. His pride stung, but the pain was louder, drowning out any resistance he might have mustered. Emily guided him to their weathered Honda Civic, sliding the passenger seat back as far as it would go to accommodate the absence of his prosthetic. Tonight, even the thought of wearing it was unbearable. The pain was so intense that even the lightest brush of fabric against his skin felt like 1,000 needles. The drive to Lincoln County Medical Center, 15 miles away, was a quiet ordeal. Emily kept her eyes fixed on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, but every red light stretched into an eternity, amplifying the weight of the silence between them. She stole glances at David, her heart twisting at the sight of him. He clutched the door handle with a white-knuckled grip, his face slick with sweat despite the cool spring air seeping through the cracked window. His breaths were shallow, each one a battle to suppress the groans clawing at his throat. The pain was a living thing consuming him, and Emily felt its shadow looming over her too, a helpless witness to his suffering. When they finally reached the hospital, the main entrance seemed to taunt them from across the crowded parking lot. The ER was a hive of activity, cars jammed into every available space, a testament to the chaos of a Saturday night. Emily circled twice, her frustration mounting, until she spotted a loading zone marked for emergency drop-offs only. It wasn't meant for parking, but rules were the last thing on her mind. David was her priority, his pain her only focus. She pulled into the spot, killed the engine, and hurried to the passenger side, grabbing his crutches from the back seat. David, ever defiant, tried to wave her off, insisting he could manage alone, but his voice was strained, his face pale and drawn, etched with lines of agony. His shoulders sagged under the weight of exhaustion, and his jaw was locked so tightly it seemed it might shatter. Emily ignored his protests, slipping an arm around his waist to steady him as he eased out of the car. Each movement was a fresh wave of torment, rippling through his body, and he bit down hard to keep from crying out, his pride waging a losing battle against his pain. "Just get to the door," Emily whispered, her voice soft but urgent, laced with a quiet strength that belied the fear churning inside her. "I'll move the car after, I promise." David managed a weak nod, leaning into her support as they began the slow, arduous trek across the pavement. Each step on his crutches was a monumental effort, like scaling a mountain with no summit in sight. His body screamed for relief, but his mind clung to the stubborn resolve that had carried him through years of this torment. Emily's arm around him was both a lifeline and a reminder of his vulnerability, a duality that gnawed at him even as he relied on her strength. They didn't notice the security guard at first, too consumed by the immediate need to reach the ER doors. Their focus was narrow, honed to the singular goal of getting David inside, of finding some semblance of relief. Survival and dignity were all that mattered in that moment, the world beyond their struggle fading into insignificance. But Officer Jean Kraton was watching, his presence a shadow they hadn't yet registered. At 43, Kraton was a man hardened by disappointment, his bitterness a heavy cloak he wore with every step. He had served 8 years in the Army, with 2 tours in Iraq, a fact he never let anyone forget. But the uniform he once wore with pride had been stripped away, not by choice but by circumstance. A back injury and a clash with a commanding officer that left his record stained and his career in ruins. The years that followed were a series of letdowns: parking enforcement, mall security, overnight warehouse patrols, jobs that never carried the weight of authority he craved. Now, stationed outside Lincoln County Medical Center's emergency entrance, he wore a black windbreaker emblazoned with "Security" in bold white letters, his guts straining against his duty belt. The taser at his side was a small comfort, a symbol of the control he'd lost elsewhere in his life. Kraton wasn't always this way, but the world had stopped saluting him long ago, and the resentment had taken root, festering into something cold and unyielding. He clung to this job like a lifeline, desperate to feel the authority he'd once known. Tonight, he saw an opportunity to assert it. His eyes locked onto Emily's car the moment it pulled into the loading zone, his gaze narrowing as she helped David out. To Kraton, it wasn't just a car in the wrong spot. It was a challenge, a chance to reclaim the respect he felt the world owed him. As David and Emily shuffled toward the entrance, their focus on each other and the pain that bound them, Kraton stood with arms crossed, his expression hard, ready to make his presence known. David's crutches dug into the asphalt, each step a grueling battle against the pain radiating from his missing leg. The hospital parking lot buzzed with chaos, cars weaving, people rushing. But for David, the world was a tunnel of agony, every movement a test of endurance. Emily's hand on his arm was a lifeline, her touch gentle but laced with a quiet urgency. Her eyes flicked between him and their car, parked hastily in the drop-off zone out of necessity, not rebellion. She could feel the weight of David's struggle in the tension of his muscles, the way he gritted his teeth, fighting to keep his pride intact despite the pain that threatened to bring him to his knees. Officer Kraton stood like a gatekeeper, his clipboard a symbol of his unyielding authority. His face was hard, his eyes cold with disdain. To him, David and Emily were just another violation, a car in the wrong place, a challenge to the rules that gave his life meaning. Enforcing those rules, barking orders, and scribbling citations were the only sparks of satisfaction in a job that had long since drained him of empathy. He strode forward, already writing a ticket, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Ma'am, this is an active drop-off zone. Got a hospital-issued permit, or are you just ignoring the sign?" Emily froze, her heart pounding as the weight of the day pressed down on her. Endless hospital calls, sleepless nights, the relentless fight to get David the care he needed. But it was the sight of her husband, pale and trembling, that anchored her. "I'm helping my husband inside," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "He's in pain. We're here for emergency care." Kraton's eyes didn't soften. "That's not an answer," he snapped, stepping closer, his clipboard a barrier between him and their humanity. "You can't leave your vehicle here without clearance. Move it, now." His tone was a wall, unyielding, built on the power he wielded so freely. David's breath caught, the short walk from the car sapping his strength. He raised a shaking hand, his voice calm but heavy with the weight of a man who had faced worse than this. "Sir, I'm a Marine Corps veteran. We're here for emergency care. I just need a moment to—" "You need a moment?" Kraton cut him off, his voice thick with mockery. He stepped closer, his gaze flicking to David's prosthetic leg, barely hidden by his pant leg. "Buddy, I've seen your type. Everyone thinks they deserve a medal and a parking spot just because they served. Newsflash? We all did our time. That doesn't make you special." The words struck David like a fist, not because they were true, but because they echoed the doubts he carried, the fear that his sacrifice was invisible, reduced to a limp and a sob story. He'd never wanted pity, never asked to be defined by the leg he'd lost in a foreign blast. But Kraton's sneer, the way he dismissed David's pain as if it were a personal failing, ignited a fire in his chest. His knuckles whitened around his crutches, his restraint a thin thread stretched to breaking. Emily's eyes flashed with fury, her calm unraveling. She'd spent years navigating the chaos of David's recovery, hospital stays, VA paperwork, nights when he woke screaming from phantom pain. She'd held him through it all, her love a quiet force against his shame. But this public dismissal of her husband's sacrifice, cut deeper than any wound. "He lost his leg overseas," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "He's in severe pain. We're asking for basic human decency." "Basic decency?" Kraton sneered, his voice rising, drawing eyes from the parking lot. "You think parking wherever you want, ignoring the signs, is decent? You're not above the law. Nobody is." His smirk was a challenge, a dare to push back so he could assert his dominance further. For Kraton, this was about control, about proving his authority over two people who dared to defy him. David's fingers tightened around his crutches, the metal biting into his palms. 3 tours had taught him the cost of conflict, the toll it took on body and soul. He didn't want to fight, never had. But the way Kraton spoke to Emily, the way he reduced David's loss to a cheap excuse, made his blood boil. "I'm not asking for special treatment," he said, his voice low but edged with steel. "I'm just asking you to be human." "Then act like one," Kraton shot back, pointing his pen at David's prosthetic like it was proof of laziness. "You're not dying, you're just lazy. Move the car or I'll have it towed." The words cut deeper than they should have, echoing the doubts David fought daily, the fear that his injury made him less, that his struggle was invisible. Emily's hands shook, her mouth tight with disbelief. She'd always been the calm one, the anchor through 10 years of marriage, hospital stays, and David's darkest days. She'd never raised her voice in anger. But now, with her husband's pain mocked so casually, something inside her broke. She stepped forward, planting herself between David and Kraton, her shoulders squared, her voice steady but burning. "Sir, I'm asking you, please step back. My husband needs emergency care. We're not trying to cause trouble." Kraton crossed his arms, a smirk tugging at his lips. He leaned in, his voice mocking. "Lady, if he needs help, the ER is right there. Go check in and move the car like everyone else. You're not special. His words were a blade slicing at Emily's restraint. She inhaled slowly, her chest tight with a heat that threatened to consume her. You keep saying that, she said, her voice rising, each word a deliberate strike. Like it's a crime to need help. He served 3 tours. He lost his leg over there. He's not a sob story. He's a human being who's had to fight for everything, including the right to stand here. And I'm not moving that car until he's inside and registered. Kraton's smirk vanished, his hand drifting toward his belt, resting near his holstered taser. His eyes narrowed, his voice low and threatening. Ma'am, you're becoming agitated. That's disorderly conduct. Don't make this harder than it has to be. The threat was clear, a reminder of the power he held, the power he relished. To him, David and Emily were obstacles, challenges to his authority, and Kraton had built his career on making people regret crossing him. The parking lot grew quieter, the hum of activity slowing as people began to notice. A couple paused, their eyes flickering with curiosity and unease. A nurse lingered near the entrance, her hand hovering over her phone, uncertain whether to step in. For David, the attention was a fresh wound, a reminder of the stares he'd endured since coming home, a man reduced to a spectacle. For Emily, it was fuel, a reason to stand her ground. She wouldn't let this man strip her husband of his dignity. At the edge of the hospital parking lot, Emily stood frozen, her heart pounding as the world around her seemed to tighten like a noose. A teenage boy in a faded hoodie, his face half hidden under the brim, fumbled with his phone, the camera lens glinting as he aimed it at the unfolding scene. 2 nurses in pale blue scrubs lingered just inside the hospital's sliding glass doors, their steps slowing as curiosity and unease pulled their gazes toward the confrontation. Emily felt the weight of eyes on her, a shifting tide of attention that made the air feel heavy, electric. Phones were out now, recording, judging, amplifying the moment. The crowd wasn't large, but it was enough to make her skin prickle with awareness. Kraton, the security guard, stood rigid, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade. You have 10 seconds to move your vehicle, or I'm calling for a tow and writing you both up for obstruction. His tone wasn't just firm, it was laced with a smug authority that made Emily's stomach twist. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, a mix of indignation and defiance bubbling up. But she held her ground, her hands clenched at her sides. David, leaning heavily on his crutches, tried to diffuse the situation, his voice low and steady despite the tremor of frustration beneath it. Officer, please, we don't want trouble. My wife's just trying to help. We'll cooperate, I promise. Just give us a moment. His words were careful, measured, the kind of tone he'd perfected over years of navigating a world that often felt stacked against him. But Kraton's eyes narrowed, his sneer cutting deeper than his words. Then control your wife, or I will. That was the spark. Emily's restraint snapped like a taut wire. Her voice lashed out, sharp and unyielding, each word a deliberate strike. Excuse me? She stepped forward, ignoring David's gentle reach for her arm, his soft Emily, please. She was too far gone, her fury a living thing now, propelling her toe-to-toe with the guard. Don't you ever talk to him like that. Don't you dare try to intimidate a man who sacrificed his leg for this country. You're standing there with your taser and your badge, acting like you're untouchable, but he's standing here with dignity. Who do you think history will remember? Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth and rage. Kraton's face darkened, his jaw tightening as the crowd's murmurs grew louder. More phones appeared, their lenses like silent witnesses to a moment spiraling out of control. A nurse in the doorway whispered into her walkie-talkie, her eyes darting between Emily and the guard. A woman in a floral blouse clutched her husband's arm, pointing, her whispers blending into the growing buzz that rippled across the parking lot. The energy had shifted, and Kraton felt it, a subtle loss of control that made him dig in harder instead of stepping back. Last warning, he barked, his voice colder now. Back away from me. You're out of line. Emily didn't budge. Her eyes burned with defiance, her heart racing with the kind of courage that comes from being pushed too far for too long. No, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. We're done being pushed around. The tension was palpable now, thick as the summer heat pressing down on the asphalt. David's jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the grips of his crutches. He wanted to end this, to pull Emily back, to make it stop before it went too far. But deep down, he knew it was already too late. The air crackled with the inevitability of what was coming. Then it happened. A flicker of movement, barely noticeable. Emily's hand twitched near her hip, an instinctive gesture born of frustration, not aggression. But to Kraton, it was enough. His hand shot to his taser, the bright yellow weapon gleaming in the sunlight as he raised it without hesitation. There was no warning, no pause, just the sharp, deafening pop of electricity slicing through the air. The electrode struck Emily square in the chest, and her body reacted instantly, jerking backward as if pulled by invisible strings. Her eyes widened in shock, then rolled back, a guttural sound, half gasp, half cry, tearing from her throat. Her legs gave out and she crumpled to the pavement, her sundress tangling around her knees, her palms scraping against the rough asphalt as her muscles spasmed uncontrollably. The sound of the taser echoed off the hospital's brick walls, a harsh punctuation to the chaos. The small crowd erupted, gasps, a woman's shriek, the clatter of a dropped phone. But for David, the world went silent. The noise around him, the guards shouting, "She was non-compliant!" The nurse calling for backup, the murmurs of the onlookers, faded into nothing. All he could hear was a ringing in his head, a pressure building like a storm. It wasn't just the present crashing down on him, it was the past clawing its way back. Afghanistan, the sand, the relentless heat, the chaos of a checkpoint gone wrong. A young boy on a moped, moving too fast, not stopping in time. The shot fired too quickly. The father's wail, raw and unending, as David's squad scrambled to contain the fallout. He had stood there that day, helpless, watching a tragedy unfold, powerless to undo what had been done. The guilt had burrowed into him, a wound that never fully healed. And now here he was again, trapped in that same suffocating helplessness. But this wasn't a stranger. This was Emily. His Emily. The woman who had sat with him through sleepless nights, her hand steady in his, when the phantom pain in his missing leg kept him awake. The woman who had learned to change his dressings with care, who read through stacks of VA paperwork when he was too broken to face it. The woman who packed his lunches before appointments, who set alarms for his medications, who kept him anchored when bitterness threatened to swallow him whole. She was lying on the pavement now, her body twitching, her eyes wide with pain and confusion. And David couldn't run to her. His crutches had fallen, clattering to the ground. His leg, the one that wasn't there, throbbed with phantom pain, a cruel reminder of his limitations. He pushed forward anyway, his heart screaming what his body couldn't do, desperate to reach her, to shield her, to undo the moment that had already shattered their world. David's heart thundered in his chest as he dragged himself across the coarse asphalt, his knee grinding against the pavement, one hand clawing forward while the other reached desperately for Emily. Pain radiated from his prosthetic leg with every movement, but the sight of her, crumpled, trembling, her body still reeling from the taser's jolt, lit a fire in him that drowned out the physical agony. "Emily," he rasped, voice thick with desperation. "Emily, I'm here." His chest tightened with fear, guilt, and a helpless rage, but beneath it, a spark of resolve flickered to life. He couldn't let this be another moment where he stood frozen, watching someone he loved suffer in silence. Officer Kraton towered above them, his taser still gripped tightly, his eyes scanning the growing crowd with a mix of defiance and unease. "She didn't comply," he declared, his voice loud and rehearsed, as if already crafting his defense for the report. "She got aggressive. I had to subdue her." The words sounded hollow, a flimsy justification against the rising tide of murmurs from the onlookers. The crowd wasn't just observing now, they were filming, phones raised like silent witnesses. Some faces were wet with tears, others etched with disgust. A nurse, her badge swinging as she rushed forward, knelt beside Emily, her hands moving with practiced urgency to check her pulse. Another staff member spoke rapidly into a radio, her voice sharp with alarm, summoning help to make sense of the chaos. Emily lay on the pavement, her breaths quick and shallow, her fingers twitching as the taser's aftershocks faded. Her eyes, brimming with tears, weren't just from the pain. They carried the weight of humiliation, disbelief, and a betrayal that cut deeper than the electric shock. She'd only been trying to help David, her husband, a disabled veteran, get to the hospital for care. Now she was sprawled on the ground, exposed before strangers, her dignity stripped away. Her mind churned. How did it come to this? She'd raised her voice to explain, to show Kraton David's VA card, to make him understand the urgency, but he hadn't listened, hadn't cared. The memory of his cold, unyielding stare as he raised the taser lingered, a wound as raw as the one in her body. David reached her side, his trembling hand gently covering hers. The pain in his hip burned dully, the ache behind his eyes sharp, but they faded as he looked at her. Something shifted inside him, a seismic change in his soul. Fear still clawed at him, but it was no longer the loudest voice. A fierce determination burned brighter, steadying his hands and slowing his racing heart. He wasn't the bystander he'd been before, paralyzed as the world fell apart. This time, he could act. Sitting beside Emily on the cold pavement, he squeezed her hand, his breath finding a steady rhythm. Around them, the murmur swelled, nurses whispering into radios, onlookers exchanging stunned glances, phones capturing every moment of the injustice. David's focus sharpened, cutting through the chaos. He adjusted his posture, ignoring the scream of pain in his legs as he rose to one knee, balancing on his prosthetic. The effort pinned agony through him, but he pushed it aside, his eyes locking onto Kraton. The officer stood rigid, taser still in hand, his gaze darting across the crowd, searching for control that was slipping away. David's voice sliced through the tension, low and steady. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, each word deliberate, "but you just made a mistake." Kraton blinked, startled not by the words but by the unshakable conviction behind them. David's tone wasn't emotional or threatening. It was something more dangerous, confident, and informed, resolute. David rose fully, slowly, his prosthetic leg protesting with every inch. The pain was a distant roar now, drowned by his purpose. "You used a weapon," he continued, voice clear and measured, "on an unarmed civilian in a hospital loading zone, while she was assisting a disabled veteran in accessing emergency care." Kraton tried to interrupt, but David raised a hand, just enough to silence him without raising his voice. "You violated federal law," David said, words precise and unhurried. "The VA Caregiver Support Act protects spouses providing aid to veterans. You interfered with medical access under duress. That's enough for a Department of Justice review." The crowd's murmurs grew sharper. Kraton's confidence faltered, his eyes flicking to the phones, the hospital staff forming a loose semicircle. A man in a suit emerged from the ER doors, striding purposefully, a hospital administrator likely. Two uniformed officers approached from the parking lot's far end, their radios crackling, their expressions cautious. David pressed on. "You escalated a nonviolent situation," he said, voice gaining strength. "You ignored identification. My VA card, which I gave you, is in your pocket. You dismissed a medical emergency, then used force without warning. You didn't call for backup, didn't attempt de-escalation, and deployed a taser in front of witnesses and cameras." Kraton's jaw moved, but no words came. His bravado was crumbling, replaced by doubt, maybe fear. The nurses stood with arms crossed, faces hard with anger. Some staff clutched clipboards like shields, others visibly shaken, hands trembling. The two officers stepped closer, one asking cautiously, "Everything okay here?" David didn't flinch, holding Kraton's gaze. "This officer just assaulted my wife with a taser during a medical emergency," he said firmly. "You'll want to speak with the ER nurse, check the security cameras, and talk to about 20 witnesses. I'd like a formal statement taken immediately." The man in the suit stepped forward, adjusting his tie nervously. "I'm Mark Feldman, Director of Hospital Operations," he said, voice tight but professional. "I saw what happened." His eyes darted between David, Emily, and Kraton, grappling with the weight of the moment. But David's focus remained on Emily, her hand in his, her breathing steadier, but her eyes still stormy with emotion. He wouldn't let her pain be erased. This time he was her shield, her voice, her strength. The hospital parking lot was a blur of flashing lights and hurried footsteps. the air thick with tension that clung to everyone present. On the flickering screens inside the hospital's security office, the incident replayed in stark clarity. Mark Feldman, the hospital administrator, stood with his arms crossed, his face etched with a mix of frustration and resolve. "Mr. Mallister," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency, "I assure you this will be handled swiftly and appropriately. We're already taking steps to ensure justice is served." David Mallister stood motionless, his weathered face a mask of calm that belied the storm raging within. His eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked onto Mark's. Beneath his composed exterior, a torrent of emotions churned: anger at the injustice, worry for Emily, and a bone-deep exhaustion from years of fighting battles, both on distant fields and in moments like these. "Then start by getting her medical care," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of a command. "Now!" Mark didn't hesitate. With a quick nod, he signaled to a nearby nurse. "Wheelchair, immediately!" The words barely left his mouth before two orderlies rushed forward, pushing a gurney through the crowd. Their movements were practiced but gentle as they approached Emily, who lay on the cold asphalt, her body still trembling from the taser's cruel jolt. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, each one a quiet testament to her resilience. As they lifted her onto the gurney, her hands gripped the edges, knuckles whitening, not from pain alone, but from the overwhelming mix of fear, relief, and defiance coursing through her. She was no stranger to hardship. She'd cared for David through countless sleepless nights, flare-ups of his phantom pain, and the bureaucratic maze of veteran care. But this was a violation she hadn't braced for. As the orderlies wheeled her toward the glowing ER doors, Emily craned her neck, her glassy eyes searching for David. When their gazes met, something unspoken passed between them. A flicker of pride, fierce and unbroken, shining through her pain. She saw in him the man who'd stood tall against chaos before, not with fists, but with an unshakable sense of right. And he saw in her the woman who'd never backed down, who'd fought for him with every ounce of her being. That look tethered them, a lifeline in the chaos. David didn't move from his spot. His leg throbbed, the phantom pain from his old injury flaring under the stress. But he stood firm, rooted by a resolve that had carried him through worse. His gaze shifted to Officer Kraton, who now stood off to the side, his earlier bravado crumbling under the weight of David's stare. Kraton's eyes darted away, unable to meet the quiet condemnation before him. David's voice cut through the silence, each word deliberate and heavy. "You picked the wrong day to power trip, sir, and the wrong people." There was no venom in his tone, only a cold, unyielding truth that left Kraton shrinking further into himself. Without another glance, David turned and followed the gurney into the hospital, his limp more pronounced, but his purpose unwavering. Behind him, the crowd stood in stunned silence, not because of a brawl or a spectacle, but because they'd witnessed something rarer, a quiet, righteous reckoning. The parking lot, moments ago alive with shouts and sirens, fell into an almost reverent hush. By sunrise, the story had outgrown the small confines of Lincoln County. A teenager lingering at the edge of the parking lot with a phone in hand had captured the entire ordeal. The video, just under 3 minutes, was raw and unflinching. The heated argument, the taser's sharp crackle, Emily's collapse, and David's measured but relentless dismantling of Kraton's authority. Uploaded online, it spread like wildfire. By mid-morning, it had racked up over 20,000 shares, the number climbing into the hundreds of thousands by noon. Local news stations picked it up first, their anchors recounting the incident with a mix of awe and outrage. By evening, national outlets were running segments with headlines like, "Veteran stands tall without raising a fist." The footage struck a chord, a vivid reminder of dignity in the face of cruelty. But the consequences had begun long before the story went viral. That very night, Officer Kraton was suspended pending a formal investigation. Mark Feldman, acutely aware of the hospital's failure, acted decisively. In a staff-wide email sent before dawn, he wrote, "We cannot and will not tolerate aggression toward patients or their caregivers, especially in their moments of greatest need. Last night, we failed in our duty of care. That failure begins with accountability." His words were a public acknowledgement of the hospital's shortcomings, a promise to do better. The investigation was swift and uncompromising. The video left no room for ambiguity. In witness statements, over a dozen from nurses, bystanders, and EMTs corroborated every detail. Kraton's own incident report, riddled with inconsistencies, collapsed under scrutiny. Within 5 days, he was terminated, his badge stripped away. But David and Emily knew a firing alone couldn't erase the damage. The hospital, too, understood this. They invited the couple to a closed-door meeting with the board, a chance to address the deeper wounds. In that sterile conference room, David sat at the end of a long table, his leg propped on a padded stool to ease the phantom pain that still gnawed at him. The ache was a constant companion, a reminder of sacrifices made long ago, but it didn't weaken his resolve. Emily sat beside him, her arm looped through his, her presence a quiet anchor. Her eyes, though still shadowed by the memory of that night, held a fierce determination. She let David speak first, knowing his words would carry the weight of their shared pain. "I don't want your apology," David said, his voice steady but resonant, filling the room. "I want the next veteran who shows up here at midnight, hurting and desperate, to be treated like a human being. I want the next caregiver who dares to raise her voice for someone she loves to walk away standing, not end up on the asphalt." His words weren't loud, but they landed with the force of a hammer, each one a plea and a demand wrapped into one. The board members shifted in their seats, some nodding, others looking down, grappling with the weight of their institution's failure. Emily tightened her grip on David's arm, her heart swelling with pride, but also aching with the memory of her own helplessness that night. She'd always been the one to fight for him, through VA red tape, through nights when his pain kept them both awake. But lying on that pavement, she'd felt stripped of her strength. Now, sitting here, she felt it returning, fueled by David's unwavering resolve and their shared purpose. She didn't speak, but her presence spoke volumes, a testament to the love and loyalty that had carried them through. The message resonated. Within 2 weeks, Lincoln County Medical Center rolled out sweeping changes. Mandatory de-escalation training was instituted for all hospital security staff, as well as on-duty nurses and reception workers, designed to prevent another moment of reckless aggression. A new protocol was launched specifically for veterans and their caregivers, offering priority triage for service-related conditions and clearer signage for emergency parking zones. But the most significant change was the Veteran Respect and Response policy, crafted with input from VA counselors, former military medics, and caregivers like Emily. It emphasized trauma-informed care, proper verification of VA documentation, and strict guidelines on when force could or could not be used near patients seeking emergency help. Unofficially, the staff named it after David's words from that night, the 6-word standard. "Sir, you just made a mistake." It became a quiet mantra, a litmus test for every decision. Would this action hold up under that calm, piercing challenge? The phrase carried no threat, but its power was undeniable, a reminder of the night one man's restraint had exposed a system's flaws. Kraton's badge was gone, a small but necessary consequence. Yet what mattered more was what Lincoln County gained, a hospital that began to shed its cold bureaucratic shell, slowly learning to see the people it served. For David and Emily, the changes were a start, a fragile promise that their pain, both from that night and from years of unseen battles, hadn't been in vain. As they left the hospital that day, Emily's arms still looped through David's. They carried with them not just hope, but the quiet strength of a community beginning to listen. David had become a vessel for something greater than himself, a soul forged not through legal battles or public outcry, but through the quiet, unshakable resolve of a man both shattered and whole. In the days after that fateful night, he found himself waking from sleep that was, for the first time in months, unbroken by nightmares. The phantom pain in his missing legs still surged, a relentless tide of fire that ebbed and flowed, but something within him had shifted. It wasn't just the new medication prescribed by the VA's pain specialist or the promise of better care. No, this change ran deeper, touching a part of him he thought had been buried in the dust of Afghanistan. For the first time since the explosion that stole his leg and nearly his spirit, David felt truly seen. not as a wounded veteran dragging himself through life, not as a burden to those around him, but as a man with a voice that still carried weight, a purpose that refused to be extinguished. That moment in the parking lot replayed in his mind, not as a blur of anger or fear, but as a beacon of clarity. When he spoke those 6 words, "I'm sorry, sir, but you just made a mistake," they hadn't come from rage or desperation. They had risen from a place of conviction, a spark of the man he used to be. Not the Marine in dress blues, not the soldier who once led missions with unwavering focus, but the protector who believed in standing for something larger than himself. This time, his battle wasn't fought with rifles or in distant deserts. It was fought in the quiet act of refusing to be dismissed, of shielding his dignity and his wife's in a world that too often overlooked them both. That night, David rediscovered a sense of duty, not to a flag or a commander, but to the life he and Emily were fighting to hold together. Emily, too, was transformed by that night. For years, she had been the silent pillar of their shared struggle, navigating the labyrinth of medical appointments, researching David's conditions late into the night, battling insurance companies over endless phone calls, and soothing him through the jagged peaks of his pain. She had done it all without complaint, believing her role was to keep the pieces of their life from falling apart, to be the steady hand while David wrestled with his demons. But that night, something inside her had fractured, not in defeat, but in awakening. When she raised her voice, it wasn't just anger that fueled her. It was the culmination of years spent swallowing her own exhaustion, her own fears, her own quiet rage at a system that seemed to see her husband as a file number rather than a man. Standing toe-to-toe with a security guard twice her size, she felt no regret. Instead, she felt a surge of pride, not for the sharpness of her words, but for the line she had drawn in the sand. For the first time, she wasn't just David's advocate behind closed doors. She was his partner in a moment that demanded to be seen, a woman who refused to let disrespect silence their pain. The world's reaction was swift and polarized. The video of that night, captured by a bystander's phone, spread like wildfire across the internet. Some comments were vicious, slicing through David and Emily's story with cold dismissals. He should have followed the rules. Just another entitled vet looking for attention. Those words stung, each one a reminder of how easily their struggle could be reduced to a caricature. But those voices were soon overshadowed by a tidal wave of support. Veterans who knew the weight of invisible wounds, nurses who had seen too many patients dismissed, single mothers who understood the grind of caregiving, and countless others who had felt the sting of being ignored. They all saw themselves in David and Emily's stand. Among the flood of messages, one stood out, a simple note from a stranger in Kentucky. "Thank you for standing up without tearing down. You reminded us what quiet courage looks like." David didn't reply to many of the messages, overwhelmed by their sheer volume, but he saved that one. It captured the heart of what they had done. They hadn't set out to make a spectacle or to spark a movement. They had simply wanted to survive that night, to walk away with their dignity intact. But in refusing to shrink, in holding their ground with steady resolve, they had painted a new portrait of strength, one rooted not in power or aggression, but in love, in pain endured, and in a courage so quiet it roared in its own way. David's words, spoken with calm precision in that parking lot, rippled far beyond the asphalt where they stood. Within days, "I'm sorry, sir, but you just made a mistake," became a mantra, shared not with fury, but with reverence. It appeared on coffee mugs sold to raise funds for veteran support groups, was quoted in quiet posts on social media, and even found its way into frames hung in hospital break rooms where weary staff drew inspiration from its understated power. The phrase didn't ignite protests or fuel outrage. Instead, it invited reflection, a reminder that true resistance doesn't always need to shout. It can speak with clarity, with restraint, with a dignity that refuses to be ignored. Veterans organizations shared the video, holding up David's composure as a masterclass in moral authority, a lesson in how to stand tall without stooping to cruelty. Mental health advocates lauded Emily's bravery, emphasizing the vital role of caregivers whose voices often go unheard in moments of crisis. Some hospitals, prompted by the incident, began reevaluating their security protocols, asking how empathy and trauma-oriented Awareness could be woven into the fabric of emergency care. But the most profound impact came from ordinary people, viewers who saw their own stories reflected in David and Emily's. In the comments beneath the video, they poured out their own struggles. Veterans frustrated by VA delays, families navigating miscommunications in overcrowded emergency rooms, caregivers who had held their loved ones together through battles no one else could see. Others shared tales of their own quiet courage, moments when they too had stood their ground, not with fists or fury, but with the steady resolve to demand respect. For David and Emily, these stories were a lifeline, a reminder that their stand hadn't just been for themselves. It had been for everyone who had ever felt invisible, for every voice that had been drowned out by indifference. That night in the parking lot, born of pain and necessity, had become something larger, a testament to the kind of bravery that doesn't need to be loud to leave an indelible mark. In the soft glow of a late afternoon, David stood at the edge of a crowded hospital waiting room, his weathered hands clutching a folded veteran's cap. His eyes, etched with years of memories, both proud and painful, scanned the room. He wasn't here for himself, but for his wife, Emily, whose quiet strength had carried them through decades of challenges. The sterile hum of the hospital felt like a distant echo of the chaos he'd once known on battlefields. Yet it was here, in this ordinary place, that a small act of truth would unfold, rippling through hearts in ways no one could have predicted. David's presence often went unnoticed. To the hurried nurses and distracted visitors, he was just another aging man in a sea of faces, his military service invisible beneath his unassuming frame. But inside, he carried a weight, a tapestry of sacrifice, loss, and unspoken loyalty. He thought of Emily, resting in her hospital bed down the hall, her frail hands still reaching for his in moments of quiet. She had been his anchor through the sleepless nights of PTSD, the endless paperwork for benefits, and the countless times they'd been brushed aside by systems too overwhelmed to see them as more than numbers. Today, though, was different. Today, David felt a flicker of resolve, a need to speak a truth that had been buried too long. Across the room, Emily lay still, her mind drifting between the present and the past. She wasn't just a caregiver. She was a warrior in her own right, having fought battles no one could see. Battles of patience, of love, of holding David together when the ghosts of war threatened to unravel him. Her heart ached not just from her illness, but from the countless times she'd seen David misunderstood, his quiet dignity overlooked by those who didn't know the cost of his service. She worried for him now, alone in that waiting room, wondering if anyone would pause long enough to hear the man behind the veteran's cap. As David stood, a young nurse named Sarah passed by, her clipboard clutched tightly, her mind racing with the demands of her shift. She barely noticed David at first, but something in his posture, a stillness that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 untold stories, caught her eye. She slowed, hesitating, then approached him. "Sir, is there anything I can do for you?" she asked, her voice softer than she'd intended. David looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a clarity that made her pause. He didn't ask for much, just a moment to share a truth, that veterans and their families often felt invisible, their sacrifices reduced to checkboxes on forms, their struggles met with impatience or indifference. Sarah listened, and in that moment, something shifted. She thought of her own grandfather, a veteran whose stories she'd only half heard as a child, and felt a pang of regret for the times she'd rushed through her day without truly seeing the people in front of her. David's words weren't loud or angry. They were steady, deliberate, like a river carving its way through stone. He spoke of Emily, of her unwavering support, of the hospital visits where they had been treated as inconveniences, of the nights when the weight of memory felt heavier than any wound. His voice carried a quiet power, not demanding attention but commanding it all the same. Around them, the waiting room seemed to hush. A young mother holding her child's hand turned her head, catching fragments of David's story. An older man, waiting for news of his own, leaned closer, his eyes softening as he recognized the familiar cadence of a veteran's truth. Even the harried receptionist, who had seen countless faces pass through, paused her typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as David's words filled the air. It wasn't just his story, it was the story of so many others, of families who carried the invisible scars of service, of caregivers like Emily who poured their lives into holding their loved ones whole. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She thought of the hospital's training sessions, the ones she'd half listened to, about supporting veterans and their families. She realized now how much she'd missed, how a single moment of listening could mean more than any protocol. She reached out, touching David's arm gently, and promised to check on Emily to ensure her care was more than just routine. It was a small gesture, but to David it felt like a lifeline, a reminder that someone had seen him, truly seen him, for the first time in a long while. As the days passed, the ripple of that moment spread. Sarah began to pause more often, to ask questions, to listen to the stories behind the faces in her care. The mother in the waiting room shared David's words with her husband, a veteran himself, who felt a spark of hope that his own struggles might one day be heard. The older man, inspired by David's quiet courage, wrote a letter to a local veterans organization, offering his time to advocate for better caregiver support. And the receptionist, whose days had blurred into a monotony of forms and schedules, found herself looking up more often, meeting eyes, and offering a smile where once there had only been efficiency. David and Emily, though still navigating the challenges of illness and bureaucracy, felt a subtle shift. The hospital staff began to greet them by name, to ask about their lives, to treat them as people, not cases. It wasn't a grand transformation, but it was enough, a whisper of truth that had echoed louder than any shout. David often thought back to that moment in the waiting room, wondering how a single conversation could carry such weight. Emily, too, felt a quiet pride in her husband, knowing that his voice, though soft, had reminded others that decency still mattered. Their story touched more than just the hospital. Friends and strangers alike, moved by the couple's resilience, began sharing their own experiences. Moments when a kind word or a listening ear had changed everything. Some spoke of veterans they knew, whose struggles had been overlooked. Others shared stories of caregivers like Emily, whose love held families together through the darkest times. Each story added to the chorus, a reminder that small acts of truth and compassion could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond their origins. For those who heard David and Emily's story, it was a call to action, not a loud demand, but a gentle nudge to slow down, to see the people around them, to listen to the truths that often went unspoken. Many reached out to organizations supporting veterans, offering donations or sharing resources for caregiver support, PTSD counseling, and hospital staff training. They understood now that even the smallest gesture, a shared story, a moment of connection, could create waves of change, reaching further than anyone could imagine. David and Emily's quiet courage had reminded them all that in a world often too busy to notice, a single voice speaking with honesty and heart could still make a difference.